She's gone, Aunt, Iker said. Deicide began shaking his head slowly. The abyss gazed at him from behind his right shoulder with a pair of cheerless eyes. Deicide plopped down into the abyss, head in hands. Tears dripped down onto her oily hulk, only to be reabsorbed and sent back into the umbilical system, where the pure water would be extracted. Deicide summoned a cloud of anxiety as he began to tighten his fists and strain his muscles. The sound became frighteningly audible. Two eaters grabbed Deicide under an armpit. "Come on, sir," one said. But Deicide did not move. His new body was extremely heavy, even for two eaters, and they looked to Iker for help. The hard-faced weaver had his arms folded in front of Deicide, glaring down at the man, indifferent to his brooding. In a calm voice he spoke down toward him. "Come on, Aunt. Let's go," Iker said, tightening his lips as the suggestion was ignored. Then he berated the man. "Aunt, get the fuck up," Iker said. Everyone paused and tried to pretend they were inanimate objects. Deicide stirred and rose without the help of his subordinates, while Iker grabbed the scruff of Deicide's neck as if he were a pup. He pressed his forehead against the top of Deicide's head and began to whisper. "Stop, all right? Clean your fucking face. These knuckleheads need you strong, or else all this shit is gonna fall apart, okay?" Iker said. She... "Shut up. There'll be time for that. Right now, people need to die, and those that live need to be afraid that they're next. Understand?" Iker said, watching his favorite pupil nod, knowing hate was spinning inside Deicide's head. Back inside the Yola pile, Deicide was waiting for his children to be brought to him. His estate inside the old country had been remodeled since his disappearance some months back, perhaps a project to keep the housekeeping busy while he was away. He was fully reclined in his study, watching flames from a simulated fireplace, when a door slid open behind him. 5 children walked in on their own, while another 2 were carried by Knott's aides. Deicide looked at their eyes, some purple, brown, or some lighter shade, skin the color of khaki. They each had a short umbilical plug extending from their lower backs, though nothing was running through them. Certainly not vestige material. "They'll be bigger than their dad in a few years. They aren't showing an aversion to the treatments," a woman said. The children sat down on the floor in front of him. He felt sorry for the lovelies, as they would have very little time to actually be children before they were commanding their own armies. It was a relief to him, though, that they would not grow up exactly how he did, hopping from planet to planet, scheming for money and influence to fuel his war machine. His offspring would be tasked with the upkeep of his legacy, ensuring his ivory tower never crumbled. "There's the oldest 2, Silex and Kaisa. Then there's the little monsters, Eldora and Asudus, Capella and Gigere, my little cuties. And this little sad guy is Amicus," she said. The tiny boy in her arms was the only one that had Knott's gray complexion and yolky eyes, but on his face was the morose stare of his father, now looking back at him. He wondered, did Knott really do it? Did she manage to birth them a child from both their genetic material? Either way, he would cherish the boy, if only because he reminded him of Knott. The eldest children, Silex and Kaisa, were surprisingly well-spoken. He discovered that they had already read through the ship's archives several times. All of them were being trained by the same grizzled instructors that had taught him during his youth. Hellmouth and Great White popped in as if Deicide had willed them into the room. They immediately came over to the children and encouraged them to show their father what they had learned. Deicide was excited to see that all but the youngest 2 could spread a small kill box around themselves, even if they were only able to slightly manipulate gravity. Deicide laughed as the crimson-headed Eldora, already well-muscled, was busy wrestling his free arm, unable to pin it down. He smiled as she grunted and strained against him. All of the children already seemed set in their own personalities, and he spent the rest of the night guessing amongst the other adults which bad habits they had picked up from him. At first his cubs had lessened the pain of the blade driven through his heart by Knott's departure, but as he woke to their faces every morning, he realized it would never be taken out. He continued to plan his response against the districts which had struck down his men and women, members of his entourage whom he considered his blood, even if a few were not, people who watched over his children, people he shared meals with. The message would be elaborate and exceedingly violent, but he knew not how. Bombs, and even full-scale raids would not exhibit the magnitude of his rage. He sat on the floor of the great stone coliseum that Great White used to exercise the children. It was located on the lower decks of the Yolopile, a recreation of the crumbled Obstrusian Empire. Deicide looked on the place not as a symbol of power, but a crude memento of his childhood. Hard lessons were learned here. Much of the bloodstains here were his own, put there by his mentors, Hellmouth, White, and Iker. He held his youngest boy Amicus in his lap as they watched his older children spar with legends of fightcraft. Because of their privileged birth, they would be taught the advanced techniques of a martial art that was prohibited to the general population of eaters, dreadfully translated to the pathless journey. These secrets kept the inflexible power structure of their military-oriented society intact. Money could only purchase so much power for a civilian, and a soldier could never buy. Status was wealth, and it could only be garnered by specific and exemplary services rendered, doled out by someone who sat aloft in this infallible structure. It was a system so rigid that it barely appeared to change when looking through the long-range records. Families were shuffled in and out to give the elite some genetic variety, but the hands holding the reins never changed, even in the military. Eldor, if you're going to use that punch, you have to use your entire body, from the furthest knuckle to the very tip of the toe. See? White said, demonstrating the attack. The children were gathered around in a loose circle as White instructed the children individually. Hellmouth was making her way toward the group, causing Asotus to squirm, already knowing the fate which lay ahead. Thought you were going to miss out on PT, Hellmouth said, gold teeth glistening in the simulated twilight. The children groaned and marched toward her with their eyes to the ground, dragging their feet against the stone floor. Deicide winced as he remembered his own PT sessions with the woman. He could guarantee there would be some vomiting and teary eyes tonight. As he bobbled Amicus around in his arms, he was approached by the twins, Destra and Sinestra. He wondered if Nod had warned them about their possible futures as lumbering freaks. He gave them a small grin and decided to keep quiet. He had kept his adventure a secret from everyone, even the closest of his staff, explaining away his disappearance as a malfunction with the eccentricities of the folded space within the ship. Even if they were privy, they would dismiss his sightings as delusions caused by his transgression into his final phase. The genetic amok had torn him apart and reassembled him into something familiar that looked back at him in the mirror. But he felt very different. The desire to complete his mission was swelling deep within his mind, causing the abyss to increase her size and roughen her texture. Amicus turned and poked at the alien creature with a tiny finger. The abyss swirled around him and giggled, pulling at his gray cheeks with her inky tendrils. Deicide spoke to the twins without turning away from the suffering of his children that he found so amusing. "How are they?" Deicide said. "Not would be satisfied," Destra said. "That's a bold claim," Deicide said, remembering his wife's pride in her craftsmanship. "Which precinct has the raid?" Sinestra said. "None of them." "We have to strike back. It's been far too long already." "Iker briefed me. I'll have a small entourage." "We understand you wanting to participate, but that's foolish, Aunt. Do Hellmouth and White know?" Deicide turned to face them. "Who's the captain of this ship?" Deicide said, alerting the instructors nearby. The twins were silent, staring back at him with hard eyes. Their demeanor had changed, and they began to speak harshly. "You still retain the mind of a child, don't you, Prince?" Destra said. Deicide's eyes turned to White slivers. The gall, Deicide thought. But attacking them with harsh words would only prove their point. "Now that your edible queen is rescinded, you feel the need to assert yourself," Sinestra said. Destra looked to her sister. "It's understandable." "Yes, perfectly understandable. But you have your place as our lovable prince." "I'm no figurehead," Deicide said, letting Amicus run to his nanny. He stood and tried to keep the abyss from winding herself up, an act that every creature understood, even if not from her world. In the half-world that bore her, there was no word for violence. One may as well tell another person that one is living. "For this ship you are," Destra said. "Obstruction custom," Sinestra said. Deicide turned away at that. Having no records on how his culture was originally ran, he had never seen the twins act in such a way. It saddened him, and he wondered if there was a coup forming in his executive branch. But then he remembered how the men were treated. With so few numbers of them, and all hopes of reproducing naturally dashed away, men were simply sexless helpers of his homeworld. It was only the other male clones of Antenor I that were revered, and many of them died only a few years after birth. Yes, it had been only him, finally christened Antenor II, Prince of Obstrus, a useless title as obstrusions had eradicated the nobility millennia ago.